It's because the updating process lacks the kind of independent evidence. What's independent evidence?
Yeah,
I literally don't know what that. People use that phrase. Independent of what? Like my beliefs? Well, every person has beliefs. I have no idea what independent evidence is supposed to mean.
If my father died and then I went to the grave and it was empty, my first thought would be grave robbers. And then my mom said, no, he came back to life. I'd be like, Mom, I know you're grieving, but it's okay.
And in many of these cases, I will say, especially with modern alleged miracles, where nobody's suffering anything, I'll say, we need to just bite the bullet and be willing to be impolite and suggest that people are just lying because they suffer no consequences for lying.
All right, then. I guess I'll just go over to King Kai's place.
I know what you are thinking. What does Goku have to do with Bayesian apologetics or Trent's Historical Reportage Model, HRM? Bear with me, I will explain later in a video. This is part 4 of my critique of Trent's Bayesian apologetics. In this episode, I want to tackle the assumptions he brings in before he starts doing the calculation. I think this is very important because skeptics do not simply grant the HRM. Trent's model treats the Gospels and Acts as good faith, eyewitness-rooted historical reportage. That is not a small background assumption. Lydia McGrew agrees with this point. Their Bayesian model would not work if they only used the minimal facts approach proposed by Gary Habermas. It needs much more than that in the background.
And that's why I think the reportage model is important as a backdrop. That's why minimal facts arguments don't do the trick.
So how does Trent present HRM? What does it mean? He tells us in his blog. He says the HRM affirms that the Gospel authors understood themselves to be operating within the broad genre of historical biography. I have no major issue with that first point. I agree that the Gospels are ancient biographies about Jesus. I also agree that the authors intended their accounts to be read as historical, not as pure fiction or a myth. But intention is one thing, accuracy is another. A person can sincerely intend to write history and still pass on mistaken reports, reshape traditions, harmonize events, omit inconvenient details, or rely on sources whose reliability we cannot independently verify. We cannot just assume that they were applying the same standards as modern historians. It is entirely possible that the Gospel author could feel free to adjust Jesus' words to fit his own theological emphasis without thinking that this undermined his historical project. Later in the video, I am going to argue that this is what Luke, as an example, appears to do. This uncertainty about the standards the authors bring to their writing becomes especially important when we move to Trent's second point, that the Gospel authors sought to record the deeds and teachings of Jesus in good faith, based on sources they considered reliable, including eyewitnesses and early oral tradition. I'm actually glad that Trent didn't just declare that the Gospels and Acts were written by eyewitnesses here. Some apologists do say that, including Mike Jones. Recently, he said this.
I'm still convinced the Gospels are reliable. They're written by eyewitnesses.
They were written by eyewitnesses? That is a very bold claim. Unless Mike means something much weaker, like based on eyewitness testimony. That is hard to defend. Many Christians and most scholars would not say that Mark and Luke were eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry, especially not eyewitnesses of the resurrection. Luke himself presents his work as based on traditions handed down by eyewitnesses, not as his own eyewitness report. To Trent's credit, he does not make that same mistake here, but there are still issues with his framing, especially with how he summarizes HRM later in the blog, which I will get to in a moment. The main issue is that, for the most part, we do not actually know what sources the Gospel authors relied on. Yes, Luke explicitly says that he relied on earlier sources, and that his account was based on traditions handed down by eyewitnesses. But within the text itself, neither Matthew nor Mark gives us anything like Luke's source preface. Even Luke does not stop within the narrative and tell us this part came from Peter, this part came from Mary, or this part came from Cleopas. Matthew and Mark do not give that kind of source trail either. That matters because when a gospel author narrates an event, especially a resurrection appearance, we are usually not told specifically where that particular story came from. Was it from an eyewitness? From a second-hand report? From a third-hand report? From a community tradition? The text rarely tells us. Even in the Gospel of John, where we get something close to a source claim, the situation is still complicated. John 21:24 says, "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." But saying the beloved disciple wrote them down does not automatically mean he wrote the Gospel of John as we now have it. He may have written some notes. He may have been the source behind part of the Gospel, or his testimony may have been preserved and later shaped by others before it reached the actual author of the Gospel of John. The verse itself gives us reason to be cautious. The beloved disciple is not named. He is spoken about in the third person, his testimony. Then another voice appears and says, "We know that his testimony is true." That sounds like someone else or some group is certifying the beloved disciple's testimony. At minimum, John 21:24 may connect the gospel to the beloved disciple's testimony, but that is not the same thing as proving that the beloved disciple personally wrote the whole gospel in its final form. Anyone who wants to use this verse for traditional Johannine authorship still has to explain why the beloved disciple is unnamed, why he is spoken of in the third person, and why a "we" appears to verify his testimony. Let me clarify. I'm not saying that the Gospels never had access to eyewitnesses. The issue is that the Gospel authors usually do not give us clear indications of which events came from which sources. This is not an unreasonable standard. In other ancient biographies and histories, authors sometimes identify sources, compare accounts, or signal uncertainty. They might say, "Some report this, others say that," or "according to so and so." That does not make them modern historians, and it does not make them perfectly reliable, but it does show a kind of source awareness that allows the reader to evaluate where a claim is coming from. By contrast, the Gospels often narrate events directly without naming the informant or explaining the chain of transmission. Than knows this. That is why he originally defines HRM as involving eyewitnesses and early oral tradition. He understands that, practically speaking, we cannot establish that all the sources are first-hand. He also says that in the video.
I explicitly stated in my opening statement that not all of these are first-hand accounts. I explicitly stated some are first-hand, some are second, some are third, and that's totally fine.
And that is the problem. If some are first-hand, some are second-hand, and some are third-hand, then we need to know which claims fall into which category, especially when he is assigning strong evidential weight to resurrection appearance reports. It is not enough to say, in general, that the Gospels are based on eyewitnesses and early oral tradition. The key question is whether this specific claim in this specific passage can be traced to a reliable source. But just as I was glad that Than didn't overstate his case when he introduced HRM earlier in his blog, I was disappointed to notice what happens later. In the definition, he includes both eyewitnesses and early oral tradition, but when he later summarizes HRM, the oral tradition part drops out, and the model gets restated in much stronger terms. Eyewitness claims, eyewitness-based claims, eyewitness testimony, eyewitness-rooted historical testimony, eyewitness-based historical accounts, and so on. That is not a harmless wording change. It quietly moves from some combination of eyewitnesses and early oral tradition to eyewitness-based testimony. But those are not the same thing. A story circulating in early oral tradition may ultimately go back to an eyewitness. It may also be second-hand, third-hand, reshaped, harmonized, or misremembered. Unless Thant can show which resurrection reports are actually grounded in identifiable eyewitness testimony, this wording artificially strengthens HRM without doing the historical work. This creates a Motte and Bailey problem. The cautious claim is that the Gospels are based on eyewitnesses and early oral tradition. The stronger claim is that the Gospels give us eyewitness testimony. But early oral tradition is not the same thing as eyewitness testimony. It may go back to eyewitnesses, but it may also be second-hand, third-hand, reshaped, or impossible to trace. If Thant moves from the first claim to the second without argument, he is inflating the strength of HRM. But I am sure that if Thant is challenged on this point, he will point back to the careful version. It will be like if someone were to ask Mac Jones why he said the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. He would probably say that he only meant they were based on eyewitness accounts, or that he meant 2 of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, not all 4. But that is not what the sentence naturally communicates. Of course, even if the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses themselves, if all the resurrection accounts in the Gospels and Acts came directly from eyewitness sources, that would still be impressive. But do we have good reasons to think that? I don't think we do. We have very strong evidence, accepted by most scholars, that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a major source. But Mark is not one of the 12 disciples, and Mark is not listed anywhere in the New Testament as a witness to Jesus' resurrection. Thant could say that Mark's account is based on eyewitnesses, and therefore a text that quotes Mark can still be called eyewitness-based. But that only works if we already know that Mark faithfully preserved eyewitness reports. That is exactly the kind of assumption that needs to be argued for, not simply built into the model. This becomes even more complicated when we look at Matthew and Luke. Sometimes they preserve Mark almost verbatim. Sometimes they change Mark. At minimum, the Markan material in Matthew and Luke is mediated through Mark. It is not direct eyewitness testimony. And for the resurrection appearance stories, the source trail is even less clear, because the earliest ending of Mark does not contain resurrection appearances. It contains the empty tomb. Matthew and Luke's appearance narratives have to come from somewhere else, but the texts do not clearly tell us where. This failure to mention sources is a huge problem for Mark. Do we know that Mark accurately preserved eyewitness accounts? We don't. Mark does not tell us what sources he used. Even if he did, how would we fact-check him? Suppose Mark said, this account came from Mary Magdalene, or this account came from Peter. That would be helpful, but it still would not automatically prove that the source attribution is true or that the tradition was transmitted without alteration. Furthermore, it is not even certain that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark. The text itself is internally anonymous. Christians can argue that anonymity was normal at the time. Fine, but that still does not give us the identity of the author. The earliest clear attribution of the 4 canonical Gospels by their familiar names comes from Irenaeus around 180 CE, more than a century after Mark was likely written. One could point to Papias, who is earlier, and that is fair, but Papias does not clearly identify the text we now call the Gospel of Mark. He says Mark wrote down Peter's recollections, but he does not quote the Gospel, name any passage from it, or clearly connect his statements to our canonical Mark. For all we know, Papias may have been referring to another Markan collection, a lost text, or a tradition about Mark that later Christians connected to the Gospel. So Papias helps the traditional case, but he does not settle it. It still leaves us without an internal authorial claim and without a clear source trail for the stories in Mark. There are also questions about whether John Mark of Jerusalem is the most likely person to have composed this Greek gospel. It is not impossible. Greek was used in Palestine, and a small number of Jews there could read or write it. But the Gospel of Mark is not a short note or a simple inscription. It is a sustained narrative written in Greek. If the traditional Mark was a Jew from Jerusalem, where Aramaic was the everyday language, we need some reason to think he had the level of Greek composition needed to write this gospel. Paul writing in Greek is much less surprising because Paul came from Tarsus, a major Greek-speaking city in the diaspora. With John Mark, we do not have that kind of evidence. This does not disprove Markan authorship, but it does mean the data does not line up as neatly as apologists often suggest. Do you see how many assumptions we need to make before we can confidently say that the Gospel of Mark is eyewitness-based? First, we need to grant that the traditional attribution is correct and that Mark really was the author of the Gospel in his name. Let me be generous and assign that 30%. The exact number is not the issue. The point is that it is not close to 100%. Second, we need to assume that Mark's key traditions really came from eyewitnesses and were accurately transmitted to him without major embellishment or theological reshaping. Again, Mark does not tell us his sources, and even if he did, we would still have to ask how we know the attribution is correct. Let me be generous again and assign that 50%. 30% times 50% is 15%. Just like that, we are down to 15% before we even get to Matthew and Luke's use of Mark, their changes to Mark, their additional sources, or the source trail behind their resurrection appearance stories. And I am just barely getting started. Let me briefly talk about the Gospel of Matthew because traditionally it is attributed to Jesus' disciple, Matthew. Here we need to be careful. Papias is earlier than Irenaeus, but Papias does not clearly describe our Greek Gospel of Matthew. He says Matthew compiled the sayings or oracles in the Hebrew dialect. That does not line up neatly with the Gospel of Matthew we have now, which is a Greek narrative gospel. The earliest clear attribution of the canonical Gospel of Matthew in a four-gospel framework comes later with Irenaeus around 180 CE. That is already quite removed from the time of composition. But there is a bigger problem. If Matthew the disciple wrote this gospel, why does he appear to copy Mark when describing his own first encounter with Jesus? Compare Mark chapter 2 verses 13 to 17 with Matthew chapter 9 verses 9 to 13. In Mark, Jesus calls Levi. In Matthew, the same basic story is used, but the tax collector is now called Matthew. That is strange. If you are writing about an event where you are the central person and you personally experienced it, why would you depend on another written source from someone who was not there? Why wouldn't you tell it from your own memory? Why wouldn't you at least change the perspective from third person to first person? Of course, someone could say, maybe Matthew liked Mark's wording and decided to use it. Fine, that is not impossible, but it is awkward. It is one thing for an author to use sources for events he did not witness. It is another thing for an alleged eyewitness to copy a third-person account of his own calling from a non-eyewitness source. Some Christian apologists respond by saying that World War II veterans wrote books about World War II and still used sources, even though they lived through the war. But that analogy does not really work. A veteran would need sources to write about battles, decisions, and events he did not personally experience, but it would still be odd if he copied a third-party account to describe a specific incident where he himself was the central figure. Again, I'm not saying this is impossible. If you look hard enough, you can probably find unusual cases where something like that happened. My point is that it is highly unlikely. Matthew's use of Mark, especially in the call story of Matthew, is a serious problem for traditional Matthean authorship. Given this evidence, I would put the probability that the disciple Matthew wrote the gospel in his name extremely low. Personally, I would be comfortable putting it around 1%. The exact number is not the main point. The point is that Christian apologists should not treat traditional Matthean authorship as if it is simply established background knowledge. Some Christian apologists may point to the agreement among later church fathers on gospel authorship as evidence for the traditional attributions. I agree that this counts as evidence in their favor, but it is not decisive. a consensus among later Christian writers, especially writers who are already a century or more removed from the composition of the text, can still be mistaken. We have a clear precedent for this in Pseudo-Dionysius. For centuries, the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius were widely treated as if they came from Dionysius the Areopagite, the convert of Paul mentioned in Acts 17. That gave the writings enormous authority because people thought they came from someone connected to the apostolic age. But modern scholars widely recognize that those writings were not written by the first century Dionysius. They come from a much later Christian author, probably around the late 5th or early 6th century. That does not prove the gospel attributions are wrong, but it does show that later Christian consensus about authorship can be wrong, even when the attribution becomes deeply embedded in church tradition. That is why the Church Fathers' agreement cannot simply be treated as a trump card. It has to be weighed against the internal evidence. And in Matthew's case, the internal evidence creates serious problems for traditional authorship. Christian apologists can still retreat to the weaker claim that even if the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses, they are at least based on eyewitness testimony. But that phrase can easily mislead. If the material passed through second-hand, third-hand, or fourth-hand transmission before reaching the gospel authors, then based on eyewitness testimony is true only in a very loose sense. It is not the same as having direct eyewitness reports, and it should not be given the same evidential weight. A lot can happen during transmission. A story can be misunderstood, simplified, harmonized, embellished, or reshaped for theological reasons. This is especially relevant inside a religious community where favorable stories can be repeated because they strengthen faith, attract converts, and reassure existing believers. We can see something like this in the resurrection tradition itself. Paul gives us a very early summary of appearances, but with almost no narrative detail. Mark, in its earliest ending, gives us the empty tomb, but no resurrection appearance. Matthew adds appearances, the guards at the tomb, and the stolen body polemic. Luke gives us the road to Emmaus, Jerusalem appearances, physical proofs, and Jesus eating fish. John gives us Thomas touching Jesus, extended conversations, and the fishing scene in chapter 21. I'm not saying the development is perfectly linear in every detail, but the general pattern is clear. The later narrative accounts are more elaborate than the earlier summaries. That matters because transmission introduces more moving parts. People often compare this to the telephone game, but in some ways, oral tradition can be even messier. In a telephone game, at least there is a rule. Repeat what you heard as accurately as you can. But religious oral tradition does not necessarily work that way. People may retell a story in a way that brings out its theological meaning, makes it more memorable, resolves a problem, or answers an objection. And the problem can begin right at the start. The original person may exaggerate, misremember, communicate unclearly, or even fabricate. Then the next person may misunderstand that report. Then another person may retell it with added detail. Then another person may harmonize it with another tradition. By the time the story appears in written gospel, we may not know how many stages of transmission came before it. This is why it matters whether we are talking about direct eyewitness testimony, second-hand reports, third-hand reports, or early oral tradition. These are not all the same evidential category. If apologists want to include oral tradition and second-hand or third-hand accounts in the background assumptions of HRM, they need to be explicit about the added uncertainty. I understand why they may not want to emphasize that. It makes the Gospels sound less secure than eyewitness testimony. But that is exactly the point. If the evidence includes oral tradition, then the uncertainty introduced by oral transmission has to be included too. Otherwise, the model quietly inflates the strength of the evidence. You can't just say, no, Christians would never change what was passed down from an authoritative source. That is wishful thinking. Many non-canonical Gospels circulated in the 2nd century and beyond, and the Church eventually excluded them from the canon. Some of those authors may not have thought they were deceiving anyone. They may have believed they were presenting the true meaning of Jesus' ministry. I don't see why earlier Christian authors would have been completely immune to that same impulse. Tham seems to think we have good reasons to believe the Gospel authors faithfully preserved the testimonies and traditions they received. He says this in his third point, that they did not see themselves as having literary license to invent or reshape historical events for purely theological, symbolic, or moral purposes. But when we compare the Gospels carefully, we can already see theological reshaping inside the canonical tradition itself. Matthew and Luke both use Mark heavily, which lets us observe how later Gospel authors handled earlier material. Often they preserve Mark closely, but sometimes they change Mark, and those changes are not random. They often serve the author's own theological or narrative agenda. A classic example is the angel's message to the woman at the tomb. In Mark 16:7, the young man tells the woman, "Go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee." But in Luke 24, verses 6-7, that message is changed. The women are not told to send the disciples to Galilee. Instead, they are told to remember what Jesus said while he was still in Galilee. That is not a small wording difference. Mark points the disciples forward to Galilee, while Luke redirects the meaning backward to Jesus' earlier teaching in Galilee. And this fits Luke's larger narrative because Luke keeps the resurrection appearances in and around Jerusalem, not Galilee. This looks like Luke has reshaped Mark's tradition to fit his own geographical and theological emphasis. This matters because if Luke can reshape a resurrection tradition while still thinking he's writing orderly history, then we cannot simply assume that historical biography means strict preservation of the earlier source. I have a video that discusses this issue in more detail. The link is in the description. In short, Tham cannot simply assume that oral tradition and eyewitness testimony belong in the same evidential category. That is the very thing that needs to be argued for. There's a good reason to separate eyewitness accounts from oral traditions. We do not know that every oral tradition accurately preserves an original eyewitness report without embellishment, harmonization, misunderstanding, or invention. In fact, it would be surprising if all of them did. I hope Tham is not assuming two things at once. First, that some gospel material comes from oral tradition, and second, that those oral traditions reliably preserve original eyewitness testimony with little change. If that is part of HRM, then HRM becomes much harder to defend. It is no longer just saying the authors wrote in good faith. It is also saying the traditions they received were reliably preserved before they reached the authors. That adds another major layer of uncertainty. This is why readers of Tham's blog need to notice the shift. He first says the Gospels and Acts contain eyewitness accounts and early oral traditions, but after that, he repeatedly describes the evidence in terms of eyewitness accounts as if that is what the Gospels and Acts are basically built on. I'm not going to call that dishonest, but it does present the evidence in a much more favorable way than the earlier definition allows. I'm not being nitpicky. This distinction between first-hand testimony, second-hand reports, third-hand reports, and oral tradition is crucial for what comes next. Tham appeals to 21 distinct reports involving multimodal, multisensory encounters with the risen Jesus, but we have no good reason to assume that those reports accurately preserve the original eyewitness testimony in that strong form. This is the point Apologia and many skeptics have been making. Christians often challenge skeptics to explain how mass hallucinations could happen or how hallucinations involving multisensory experiences over 40 days could happen naturalistically. But skeptics do not accept the assumption behind that challenge. We are not granting that the Gospels and Acts accurately preserve the original experiences in that level of detail. If those details come through oral tradition, second-hand reports, third-hand reports, theological reshaping, or later narrative development, then the challenge is overstated from the beginning. This brings up another problem. Than says there are 21 distinct resurrection reports, and he uses that to update the prior probability. But what does distinct mean here? Sure, we can say there are multiple resurrection stories embedded in the 4 Gospels and Acts, but if these stories are not independent sources, and if they come from the same circle of believers transmitting traditions over time, then the number becomes much less impressive. The Gospels are not independent texts in a simple sense. Matthew and Luke use Mark, so we cannot treat all 3 as separate, corroborating witnesses. We cannot say, let's fact-check Mark. Oh, look, Matthew and Luke report the same event, so that confirms Mark. That does not work if Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a source. In that case, agreement may simply reflect literary dependence, not independent confirmation. And when we talk about independence, we can not only ask whether the written texts are independent, we also need to ask whether the alleged witnesses reported their experiences independently of each other. Did they give separate testimony before hearing each other's claims? Did they write down their experiences independently before comparing notes? Did they report appearances without knowing that others had already claimed to see Jesus? That would make the evidence stronger, but that is not what we have. The resurrection reports come from a community of believers, not from isolated witnesses independently submitting signed statements. This matters because testimony can influence testimony. If Peter says Jesus appeared to him, that can raise expectations in the group. Other disciples may become more likely to interpret dreams, visions, emotional experiences, or ambiguous experiences as appearances of Jesus. We do not need to assume dishonesty for this. Social influence, expectation, grief, group reinforcement, and religious hope can all shape how experiences are interpreted and reported. This is also one reason why I was skeptical of the children who claimed to see aliens and spaceships in the case I mentioned in part 3. Children can influence each other. If 1 or 2 children say they saw something, others may become more likely to join in, elaborate, or reinterpret what they experienced. The point is not that the resurrection reports are exactly the same kind of case. The point is that lack of independence matters. When reports arise inside an interacting group, we cannot treat each report as if it were a fully independent data point. So, even if Than counts 21 reports, that number does not automatically give him 21 independent pieces of evidence. The real question is how many genuinely independent sources we have behind those reports. And once literary dependence, oral transmission, and group influence are taken seriously, the evidential force of the number drops significantly. The bottom line is simple. If the accounts are not independent, we should not treat them as independent. Christians can believe as a matter of faith that there were 21 distinct and independent eyewitness testimonies behind these resurrection reports. That is fine, but they should not expect skeptics to grant that as historical background knowledge. Likewise, they should not expect us to believe there were 500 independent witness accounts just because Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at once. What we have is one person reporting a group appearance. We do not have 500 people independently reporting the same event. Of course, independence comes in degrees. It is not always all or nothing. For example, Paul's case is more independent than the disciples' case in one important sense. Paul was not part of the original Jesus movement, and he was not one of the disciples claiming to have seen Jesus after the crucifixion. I am willing to grant that Paul's reported vision can count as an independent line of evidence in that limited sense. But even Paul is not completely independent of the Christian proclamation because he already knew Christians were preaching that Jesus had been raised. That could have shaped the way he interpreted his own experience. Still, compared with the inner circle of disciples, Paul is much closer to an independent case. But there is no reasonable way to count the 11 disciples as 11 independent eyewitness accounts. We do not have written reports from each of them describing their own experiences of seeing the risen Jesus. Even if someone believes Matthew and John wrote 2 of the Gospels, that still leaves us with nothing directly from the other 9. There is also no reasonable way to treat the 4 Gospels as 4 independent pieces of evidence. Matthew and Luke use Mark. John may preserve some independent traditions, but the Gospels still come from the same early Christian movement. They are not 4 isolated reports from 4 disconnected witnesses. This matters because Trent is doing Bayesian analysis. In Bayesian reasoning, independence is crucial. If 2 pieces of evidence are independent, then one does not make the other more or less expected. But if one report depends on another report, or if both reports come from the same community tradition, then they cannot simply be multiplied together as if they were separate confirmations. This is where things get strange. In my pinned comment under Part 1, I wrote that historians usually do not affirm that a miracle actually happened because the updating process lacks the kind of independent evidence, real-world precedent, and reliable background data needed to justify that move. To my surprise, both Trent and Trent Doherty reacted as if independent evidence was an obscure phrase.
It's because the updating process lacks the kind of independent evidence. What's independent evidence?
Yeah,
I literally don't know what that people use that phrase. Independent of what? Like, what is it even? Do you have, well, in theory, what do you think it's supposed to mean? Independent of what? Like my beliefs? Well, every person has beliefs. I have no idea what independent evidence is supposed to mean. You should never use independent evidence, ever. The only good kind of evidence is relevant evidence, independent.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I just don't know what that phrase means.
But this should not be confusing in a Bayesian context. Independent evidence does not mean evidence that is independent of my beliefs. It means one piece of evidence is not produced by, copied from, or strongly influenced by another piece of evidence. Fortunately, I have help from someone who knows what independent evidence means, so I'll let him explain.
You have to have a conjunction of events to occur. You'd have to have some Christians that would somehow get the idea of sealing the body. They would have to get past the Roman guards. They would have to continue to persist in this myth throughout the persecution of the church, and that the probability of a conjunction is the probability of the product of its conjuncts. Okay, if they're independent, the probability of A and B and C is the probability of A times B times C. So and that shrinks fast. It's called the problem of dwindling probabilities. So let's take 4 propositions, all of which are pretty likely, 0.9, and let's say they're essentially independent. So what's the probability of their conjunction? 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9. 0.9 times 0.9 is 0.72. 0.72 times 0.9 is like 0.63-ish. 0.63 times 0.9 is 0.54-ish. So you can take 4 propositions, all of which are very likely, and their conjunction is barely more probable than not.
That explanation was basically right, apart from the arithmetic hiccup. 0.9 times 0.9 is 0.81, not 0.72. But the conceptual point is correct. If the events are independent, you multiply the probabilities. If they are not independent, you cannot just multiply them as if they are. So Trent Doherty could learn a thing or two from this guy, who also happens to be called Trent Doherty. Oh, okay, so it's the same person. That means Trent does know what independence means when he is using the concept against skeptical explanations. He understands that if multiple conditions are independent, their conjunction can shrink quickly. But when skeptics ask whether the resurrection reports are independent, suddenly the phrase becomes mysterious. And this phrase should not be news to Than either, because Lydia McGrew explained this exact issue to him in a recent conversation.
So Brian Blaze has a blog post himself, very techie blog post, to which he alludes, where he says he's modeling independence for the, resurrection hypothesis. And he's saying you have to be, virtually completely certain that these items of evidence are completely independent. Okay, so Tim and I, in our 2009 article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, we modeled the testimony of the disciples by taking, 13 people and giving them each an individual Bayes factor and then multiplying that. So it was, to the such and such power of these Bayes factors. And it is true that you're not supposed to do that if these Bayes factors are dependent in a specific way, which I'll get to in a minute, that you're going to overestimate the force of your case.
That is exactly the point. If the reports are dependent in a relevant way, multiplying them as if they were independent will overestimate the strength of the case. So when Than says he has no idea what independent evidence means, that's odd. Lydia had already explained the issue to him in Bayesian terms, and it's not just that, it gets worse, because Than himself uses the same kind of language in his blog. He writes, "You began with a skeptical prior, but when multiple pieces of independent evidence converged." This is really intriguing. So apparently independent evidence is clear enough when Than wants to use it, but when a skeptic uses the phrase to challenge his resurrection calculation, he suddenly doesn't know what the phrase means.
I'm just Googling independent evidence. What does independent evidence mean?
I mean, what are the odds that both Than and Trent suddenly don't know what independent evidence means when not too long ago, both of them had no problem either using a phrase or explaining the concept? Than did a Google search, but he could have just gone back to his conversation with Lydia McGrew, or he could have gone back to his own blog where he uses the phrase independent evidence. He also uses the phrase independent testimonies multiple times. You can see the examples on the screen. Pause the video if you want to take a closer look. I'm not going to read all of them. So is Than telling us that he used these phrases in his own blog without knowing what they meant? A phrase he later had to Google during a live stream? That seems unlikely. Here's my speculation. I think Than was influenced by Trent in a moment. I don't think Than came into the stream planning to say he didn't know what independent evidence meant. I think Trent said it first, and Than went along with it. Let's revisit the clip.
It's because the updating process lacks the kind of independent evidence. What's independent evidence?
Yeah,
I literally don't know what that. People use that phrase. Independent of what? Like my beliefs? Well, every person has beliefs. I have no idea what independent evidence is supposed to mean.
If I ask Than what he meant when he used independent evidence or independent testimonies in his own blog, I suspect he would give a perfectly reasonable answer. I doubt he would say, "I have no idea what I meant when I wrote that." So my guess is that Trent's reaction created a kind of momentarily group effect. Trent framed the phrase as confusing, and Than followed that frame. Group influence is real. Social psychologists talk about conformity, informational social influence, normative social influence, social contagion, and memory conformity. The classic Asch conformity experiments are a famous example of people going along with a group judgment even when the group is wrong. Sheriff's autokinetic experiment is another example of people's judgment converging under social influence. My point is not that Than was lying. I don't think he was. In the moment, he may have genuinely felt like the phrase was unclear, but that is exactly the point. People can be sincerely influenced by the reactions and expectations of the group around them, and that is directly relevant to the resurrection testimony. If Peter announced to the other disciples that he had seen the risen Jesus, that announcement itself could have shaped the expectations of the group. It could make others more likely to interpret dreams, visions, emotional experiences, or ambiguous experiences as appearances of Jesus. They would not need to think they were lying. They would not need to think they were conspiring. They could sincerely come to believe that Jesus had appeared to them. That is why independence matters. If one person's report can influence another person's report, then we cannot count those reports as if they were fully independent confirmations. Of course, I could be wrong about what happened in that live stream. Maybe Than was not influenced by Trent at all. Maybe he already planned to say he did not know what independent evidence meant, even though he had used similar language in his own blog. Maybe if I asked him about his own use of the phrase, he would say he did not know why he wrote it. That's possible. I just don't know which explanation is less awkward. Before I move on, can you do me a quick favor? Check if you have subscribed to my channel. This is a long video, and if you are still here, there is a good chance you find this kind of content interesting or helpful. Subscribing really helps me make more videos like this. Thank you. Now back to the issue at hand. Some of you might be thinking, okay, what if the testimonies aren't all independent? They can still be true. They can still be reporting historical facts. I agree. If Jesus really rose from the dead, we would expect him to appear to his disciples. And even if we don't have first-hand reports from each of the 11 disciples, the gospel accounts could still be reliable in the sense that they accurately report what those disciples claimed to have experienced. But even if I grant, for the sake of argument, that the Gospel and Acts accounts are based on primary sources the authors considered reliable, that still raises another question. Were those sources actually reliable? To be clear, I know that HRM does not assume that miracles happened as reported, but can we even be certain that the miracle reports themselves are genuine reports? What if some of the sources were not as reliable as the gospel authors thought? Than is not going to ask skeptics to assume those sources are reliable just because the authors consider them reliable, right? Take Matthew's report that after Jesus died, tombs were opened, many saints were raised, and after Jesus' resurrection, they entered Jerusalem and appeared to many people. Let's think about that for a moment. Suppose Matthew got this from someone who claimed to have witnessed this bizarre event. What is the probability that the report accurately reflects what this person really experienced, without embellishment, confusion, or theological shaping? I'm not even asking whether the miracle actually happened. I'm asking about the reliability of the report itself. You cannot fault skeptics for wondering whether the source behind this story was mistaken, exaggerating, or not being completely honest. And we also cannot rule out the possibility that Matthew himself created or shaped this story for theological reasons. Think about how strange this is. A public miracle supposedly happened in Jerusalem, involving many resurrected saints appearing to many people, and yet only Matthew recorded. Mark does not mention it, Luke does not mention it, John does not mention it, Paul does not mention it, Josephus does not mention it. No other ancient writer from that period mentions it. Even if Matthew had a source for this story, how many sources are we talking about? 1, 2? It cannot be 21, right? For me, this story puts a serious question mark over at least one of three things: Matthew's intention to report only straightforward historical events, Matthew's ability to judge his sources, or the reliability of the sources he used. We can also talk about the virginal conception. How did Matthew or Luke know about that? They were obviously not eyewitnesses. And when it comes to someone's virginity, the relevant testimony ultimately has to come from the person herself. Did Mary tell Matthew and Luke? I doubt it. But even if she did, would that make the story believable? Christian apologists often say the resurrection is believable because there are multiple witnesses. But for the virginal conception, the evidential situation is much weaker. At most, you have Mary's claim about her own sexual history, and maybe Joseph's claim that he was not the father. That is not the same as multiple independent witnesses to a public event. To put this in perspective, one study in the United States found that around 0.5% of women reported at least one pregnancy, while also reporting that they were virgins and had not used assisted reproductive technology. Do you think those reports are likely to be true? If you are like me, probably not. You would probably think there was misreporting, misunderstanding, embarrassment, memory error, or some other explanation. In that case, why should I trust Mary's claim even if she told me directly that her pregnancy came from the Holy Spirit? And as far as we know, Mary was not persecuted for claiming a virginal conception. We do not have the kind of evidential pressure apologists often appeal to in the resurrection case. That does not prove the virginal conception story is false, but it shows the problem. If we are already skeptical of modern self-reports of virgin pregnancy, why should skeptics simply trust an ancient theological birth narrative with an unclear source trail? We can also talk about other strange stories that make the text sound more like legend than straightforward history. Acts records that handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched Paul's body were taken to the sick, and their diseases left them, and evil spirits came out of them. Acts 19:11-12. Do you really believe the author of Acts got this from a trustworthy source who did not exaggerate or pass on miracle stories for evangelistic purposes? Maybe, but skeptics are not being unreasonable for doubting that. Let me tell you a secret. Ever since I was a teenager, whenever someone in church asked me what spiritual gifts I desired the most, my answer was always the same. I wanted the spiritual gift of instant transmission.
All right, then. I guess I'll just go over to King Kai's place.
Now, I know what you're thinking. That's Dragon Ball, not the Bible. The Bible does not talk about instant transmission or teleportation. Wrong. Acts 8 just casually drops a teleportation-like story. After Philip baptizes the Ethiopian eunuch, the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and Philip is later found at Azotus, preaching in other towns. That sounds pretty close to instant transmission. And again, how did Luke hear about this? He does not say he got the story directly from Philip. For all we know, he could have received it as a circulating church story. He could have misunderstood it. He could have shaped it. And yes, it's also possible he created the scene himself. Even if Luke did get the story from Philip, should we automatically trust Philip if he claimed that the Holy Spirit once teleported him? I hope you understand by now why critical historians do not usually say these miracles probably happened just because they are embedded in narratives that look historical. If a text contains one strange event but everything else checks out, maybe we can bracket that one event and say, who knows? But when the text contains miracle after miracle, including virginal conception, walking on water, healing clothes, teleportation, and dead people coming out of tombs and appearing in town, the burden becomes much heavier. What is the probability that all of these stories not only preserve original eyewitness testimony accurately, but also actually happened? And by the way, Acts doesn't only contain weird miracle stories that sound funny or bizarre from a modern perspective. Some of them are much darker. Acts says Ananias and Sapphira dropped dead after lying about the proceeds from selling their property. But even if Luke was recording a report he heard, do you really think we can simply rule out every natural or suspicious explanation? Think about the story in modern terms. A couple sells property and gives part of the proceeds to the leaders of a new religious movement. Shortly afterwards, one of them speaks with the leader, is accused of lying to God, collapses, dies, and is carried out. A few hours later, the spouse comes in, is questioned by the same leader, collapses, dies, and is carried out too. Which is more likely, that the Holy Spirit supernaturally struck them dead, or that something else happened, and the religious movement later interpreted the deaths as divine judgment? I'm not saying someone murdered Ananias and Sapphira. That is not my claim. My point is that murder, poisoning, coercion, panic, medical causes, or some other natural explanation would not be ruled out just because the religious leader says God did it. If something like this happened today in a church and the senior pastor said the Holy Spirit struck those 2 deacons dead, would you believe him? Of course not. You would want police involved. You would want an autopsy. You would want toxicology reports. You would want to know who was in the room, what happened before they died, and whether there was foul play. We don't even need to limit ourselves to supernatural miracle stories. There are also mundane details where the gospel authors write like they know private conversations, dreams, motives, and decisions that they were not obviously in a position to know. For example, in Matthew, the Magi visit baby Jesus, have a dream warning them not to return to Herod, and then leaves for their own country by another route. How would Matthew know that? What is the likelihood that before the Magi left Judea, they told someone about their dream and travel plans, and that this story was then transmitted accurately to Matthew decades later? I'm not saying it is impossible, but what are the odds? It cannot be very high. In Matthew 27, Pontius Pilate's wife sends him a message telling him not to have anything to do with Jesus because she suffered a great deal in a dream because of him. Again, how did Matthew know this? Did Pilate tell the Christians? Did his wife tell someone? Did a servant overhear it and pass it along until it reached the Christian community? Not impossible, but highly implausible. What seems more likely is that this is a literary or theological motive. Ancient readers were already familiar with ominous dreams warning powerful figures before major events. Copernicus' dream before Julius Caesar's death is one famous example. Maybe Matthew did not invent the story himself. Maybe someone else created it, passed it along, and Matthew accepted it as true. But either way, this is exactly the kind of detail that should make us ask, how would the author know that? There are more examples like this, but you get the idea. If you keep asking that question while reading the Gospels and Acts, how would the author know this? You will start noticing a lot of places where the text gives us private information without giving us a source trail. I hope by now you can see why skeptics are skeptical of the reliability of the Gospels, Acts, and the Bible more generally. Now let's turn our attention back to Jesus' resurrection. It's not just that Jesus came back from the dead. The claim is much stranger than that. He still has wounds or scars that can be shown to the disciples. That is already bizarre. If Jesus is truly divine and can heal himself, why preserve the wounds? Is it just for evidential purposes? He can eat fish to show that he is not a ghost but has flesh and bones. And yet, in John, Jesus appears to the disciples when the doors are locked. That is a very strange kind of body. If we harmonize the accounts, Jesus can eat fish, appear bodily, display wounds, and also show up inside a locked room. How exactly does that work? Did he pass through the locked door, the wall, the roof, the floor? And if Jesus ate fish before appearing or disappearing, what happens to the fish? Does the fish become resurrection fish and pass through solid objects with him? Does it stay behind and drop to the floor? If Jesus eats fish before ascending to heaven, does he take the fish with him? Or does it fall back down on the disciples before he disappears into the sky? You know, these are the questions that keep me up at night. And this is precisely the weakness of HRM. Sam wants us to treat the Gospels and Acts as generally reliable historical reportage, but there are too many signs that should make us cautious, even if the authors sincerely believed they were reporting facts. One miracle story is already strange, but when the text contains multiple miracle stories, and some are more bizarre than the last, that should lower our confidence. At some point, parts of the narrative start to read less like straightforward historiography and more like legend, theological storytelling, or historical fiction. We should be allowed to evaluate the stories for ourselves rather than simply deferring to the judgment of the gospel authors. In part 1, I mentioned that Josephus also recorded bizarre reports from his sources, such as a heifer giving birth to a lamb in the temple. a massive temple gate opening by itself, and chariots and armed soldiers appearing in the clouds. Josephus may have believed his sources were telling the truth, but does that mean modern readers should automatically believe those reports too? I don't think so. Now, I'm sure many of my Christian viewers are thinking of martyrdom as a response to my skepticism. They are convinced that the disciples' testimony must have been sincere because they were willing to suffer for proclaiming the risen Jesus. Trent also says in his blog that HRM includes the idea that the disciples became bold proclaimers of resurrection, even in the face of persecution and death. Given that this video is already longer than I expected, and I already have a separate video evaluating the martyrdom claim, which you can find in the description, I will not directly tackle that argument here, but I do want to ask Christians one question. Are skeptics justified in remaining unconvinced of miracle claims when no risk of suffering was involved? For example, both Tacitus and Suetonius report that Emperor Vespasian performed miraculous healings. In a story, two men approach Vespasian in Alexandria after being directed by the god Serapis. One man is blind, and the other has a useless hand or lame limb. Vespasian is asked to heal them by applying spit to the blind man's eyes and touching or trampling the disabled limb. Tacitus even says physicians were consulted and gave natural reasons why the cures might be possible. Then the healing supposedly succeeds in public. So what do Christians say about that? Most of them are not convinced. They might say the report involved honest mistake, exaggeration, political propaganda, religious enthusiasm, or deception. And I agree, those are all reasonable possibilities. But notice the consistency problem. Tacitus and Suetonius are respected ancient writers. The healing was supposedly public. Doctors were supposedly involved. And yet Christians do not simply accept the miracle as historical fact. That is exactly how skeptics feel when reading miracle reports in the Gospels and Acts. We are not being close-minded. We are applying the same kind of caution Christians already apply to miracle claims outside their own tradition. That seems to be Lydia McGrew's position. She thinks the evidence for Vespasian's healing miracle is very weak. The witnesses may have been sincere, but the healing itself could have been staged. We would not be able to tell because the witnesses were not risking anything by reporting it.
It is really weak. The witnesses are supposedly people who saw Vespasian spit and put his spit on the blind guy's eyes and then step on, in Tacitus it's his hand, I believe in Suetonius it's his foot, but step on it, and then they both, presumably jumped up and said, I'm healed, Well, okay, the witnesses, maybe they really did see that, okay? Maybe there really were these guys, walking on blind, and then Vespasian puts his spit on the guy's eyes and the guy goes, I can see. All right, maybe they're telling the truth. But does that mean that they were not mistaken about its being a miracle? Well, no, the content is such that the witnesses could easily have been mistaken in even thinking that the blind guy was blind. In fact, the doctors who examined him before said he wasn't completely blind. He could have been completely faking being blind. And the witnesses could have still been sincere, but mistaken. If they lied, so what? I mean, nothing bad happens to them. Okay, we don't know that they had a reward. Some of the people who answered Hume said, maybe Vespasian paid them. We don't know that either. Okay, but we also don't know that they were in any danger from telling it.
In other words, if the sincerity of the miracle claimant was never tested, then deception remains on the table. And even if the later report is honestly transmitted, the original source could still have been mistaken, exaggerating, or lying. With that in mind, let's revisit the Gospels and Acts. I want to remind my Christian viewers that Jesus' resurrection is not the only miracle or divine intervention in these texts. Earlier in the video, I mentioned other miracle stories, such as Mary's virginal conception. There are no eyewitnesses to that claim other than Mary herself, and we do not even know whether the story came directly from her. But even if Mary was the source, how do we know she was telling the truth? As far as we know, she did not suffer persecution for claiming a virginal conception. Her sincerity was not tested in a way apologists often appeal to when discussing the resurrection. We can also talk about Ananias and Sapphira in Acts. Do we have evidence that Peter suffered for claiming that the Holy Spirit struck them dead? No. In fact, if two people really did die after private encounters with Peter and the leaders of the movement, it would have been very convenient to interpret those deaths as divine judgment. That does not prove Peter lied. It does not prove foul play, but it does mean we cannot simply rule those possibilities out just because Acts gives us a theological interpretation. And to be clear, I'm not saying Peter was a murderer. I'm not even sure this event happened at all. The whole story could have been shaped or invented to make early Christians fear God, respect apostolic authority, and take dishonesty within the community more seriously. That is also a possible motive. How about Matthew's story of dead saints coming out of their tombs and appearing in Jerusalem? Do we know that Matthew suffered for making that claim? Did Jewish or Roman authorities pressure him to recant and he refused? We do not know any of that. We have the claim in Matthew, but we do not have evidence that the claim was tested through persecution or martyrdom. I could go on and on. The point is simple. If we apply Lydia McGrew's own standard consistently, then we are justified in being skeptical of many miracle reports in the Bible. If a miracle report involves no tested sincerity, no clear source trail, no independent corroboration, and obvious religious motivation, then skeptics are not being unreasonable for withholding belief. There is one more example I want to bring up because it shows that Christians are perfectly capable of applying skepticism when the evidence calls for it. Many Christians acknowledge that Mark chapter 16 verses 9 to 20, the long ending of Mark, was not part of the original gospel. The earliest manuscripts do not contain it, even though these verses appear in many later manuscripts and include miracle claims, such as picking up serpents, drinking poison without harm, and healing the sick. And Christians generally do not say, well, maybe the scribe who added this section sincerely believed it was original, so we should accept it. No, they recognize that Christian tradition can contain later additions, expansions, and secondary material, even when the material includes miracle claims. That matters. If Christians already accept that miracle material can enter Christian tradition without us knowing exactly who introduced it, whether the person was sincere or whether the person was willing to suffer for it, then the same caution should apply when we read other miracle stories. We do not know with certainty who wrote Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John, and even if we grant the traditional authorship for the sake of the argument, we still do not know that these authors were willing to suffer specifically for the factual accuracy of every miracle report they included. That is why Lydia's standard matters. To her credit, she does not only apply this skepticism to non-Christian ancient miracle claims, she is also willing to apply it to modern miracle claims.
And in many of these cases, I will say, especially with modern alleged miracles, where nobody's suffering anything, I'll say, we need to just bite the bullet and be willing to be impolite and suggest that people are just lying because they suffer no consequences for lying.
I agree. If there are no consequences for lying, then lying should remain on the table, whether we are dealing with ancient miracles or modern miracles. That does not mean everyone is lying, but it does mean we cannot simply rule deception out because the story sounds sincere or religious. After all, in modern courts, witnesses swear to tell the truth under penalty of perjury. And even with that legal risk, we know witnesses sometimes still lie on the stand. So when a miracle claimant faces no comparable risk, skepticism is not unreasonable. Unfortunately, Than does not seem to apply that standard consistently. In part 2 of this series, I discussed how Than presented Marlene Clips as an example of a modern miracle. He said there were brain scans showing that she had cerebral palsy at one point and that later she no longer had it. But when we look closer, that evidence is not there. Matt Dillahunty made a full-length video going through the claim, and the evidential support is much weaker than Than made it sound. Now, you would think that after the Marlene Clips case, Than would become more cautious about spreading miraculous healing stories. If you think that, you would be disappointed. Than recently shared a video about the alleged miraculous healing of James Drain.
Meet James Drain. Beginning in 2015, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which caused damage to his eyes. He was legally blind. This is irreversible damage. It cannot be fixed. He ends up becoming a Christian and decides to get baptized. And then when he comes back out of the water, something crazy happens. He says as he was blinking, he realized he's seeing light. And then he looks at the pastor and says, if miracles don't happen, you're going to have a hard time explaining this. This happened on camera during a baptism. It was immediate. We have medical documentation from before and after the event.
No, we do not have publicly released before and after medical documentation available for independent review. At least I have not seen it and cannot find it. What we have are testimonies and repeated verbal claims that medical documentation exists. That is not the same thing. This is similar to the Marlene Clips case. Than talked as if there were brain scans proving that she had cerebral palsy and then no longer had it. But when we looked closer, the documentation simply did not establish what Than claimed it established. And now we are seeing the same pattern again. Than says, we have medical documentation. But has he personally reviewed the records? Have the records been released? Do we have the original diagnosis, the ophthalmology reports, visual acuity tests, imaging, dates, doctors' names, and post-event follow-up? If not, then skeptics are not obligated to treat this as medically verified. You would think that if Christians are eager to use this as evangelistic evidence, they would want to make it as convincing as possible, publish the records, redact private information if necessary, let independent doctors examine the before and after documentation. If the case is as strong as claimed, that should help the case, not hurt it. Interestingly, James Drain's story is also similar to Vespasian's healing of the blind man. In that story, the man was not necessarily totally blind either, and Lydia McGrew herself says the event could have been staged. The witnesses could have sincerely reported what they saw while still being wrong about whether a miracle happened. So, why shouldn't the same caution apply here? The baptism was on camera, yes, but a video of someone saying, "I can see," after baptism does not prove that irreversible blindness was instantly healed. It proves that someone made that claim on camera. That is not enough. And I do wonder why the baptism was filmed from multiple angles. Maybe that church routinely records baptisms that way. That is possible, but it also means deception, staging, or exaggeration remain on the table. I'm not saying that is what happened. I'm saying Lydia McGrew's own standard allows us to consider those possibilities when nobody suffers consequences for making the claim. So why should skeptics risk being credulous? If Christians can be skeptical of Vespasian's healing, skeptics can be skeptical of James Drain's healings too. I know some of this may not seem directly related to the resurrection testimonies, but it is related to HRM. Part of the reason Than brings in HRM is so he can say that the Gospels and Acts are generally reliable historical reportage, and that gives more credibility to the sources they draw from in the resurrection case. But if we can show that some of their other miracle stories do not look like they came from reliable sources, and yet the authors still treated them as reliable, then that should make us more cautious. It raises a question about whether we should trust these authors to identify and preserve reliable sources when it comes to the resurrection. And as I have argued, it is not only miracle stories that raises suspicion. There are also mundane details that look more like literary or theological narration than carefully sourced history. Regardless, even if we grant honesty in all of these miracle reports, we still only have testimony, and testimony alone may be enough for ordinary claims, especially claims that already fit with what we know about the world. But when we are dealing with unestablished events like miracles, we should ask for more than testimony. We should want stronger evidence. That is why science works the way it does. Scientists do not just say, "Trust me, I made a discovery." They present methods, data, measurements, documentation, and analysis. Other experts can review the work. Sometimes other researchers can try to replicate the finding. And even then, scientific claims can still be overturned. Sometimes studies fail to replicate. Sometimes the methods are weak. Occasionally, outright fraud is discovered. Lydia McGrew makes this exact point.
Have you ever heard of the reproducibility crisis in science?
Yeah.
So, what are his fellow scientists actually going to do? They're going to try to reproduce his experiment, right?
Yeah, if it's possible.
Yeah. And sometimes that doesn't happen, right?
Right.
I mean, okay, so why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because to read a scientific paper stating that this is what happened and to base your further evidence on that, which some scientists do. Not all scientists go and reproduce all experiments for themselves. No, you wouldn't have the time in a lifetime to do that, right? Okay. So on any occasion, when a scientist reads another scientist's paper and looks at the data, well, it's the data that's reported. And we know there have been cases of outright fraud where somebody he just made up his data, like it didn't even really happen. And sometimes that gets caught when someone tries to go reproduce. So in a sense, you are accepting testimony when you accept the data from one paper and don't go and, maybe you don't even have the equipment to go and try to reproduce the experiment yourself. So there is actually an issue there, that you are accepting testimony, and scientists do accept testimony to some extent from one another in the form of the data that are reported.
I agree with her. Scientists do rely on testimony in a sense. When a scientist reports an experiment, other scientists do not personally witness every step. They are trusting the reported data to some extent. But that does not help the resurrection argument as much as apologists think, because scientific testimony is not usually naked testimony. It is testimony supported by methods, data, documentation, peer review, and the possibility of further testing. And even with all of that, we still know that scientific papers can be wrong. This is especially obvious in social science, where the replication crisis is a real concern. A peer-reviewed paper may report a trend, or an experiment may appear to show a causal relationship, and later research may fail to confirm it. That does not mean we reject all scientific research. It means we should be careful, provisional, and attentive to the strength of the evidence. So, if we are cautious even with modern peer-reviewed research, where documentation and data can sometimes be examined by other experts, shouldn't we be even more cautious with ancient miracle claims based only on testimony, where we cannot inspect the original data, interview the eyewitnesses, test alternative explanations, or replicate the event? I think this follows naturally from Lydia's own point. Some apologists say, well, we trust expert testimony today, so why demand more than testimony for the resurrection? But that misses the distinction. Scientists do not just give their testimony. They provide evidence that other qualified people can examine. We may personally lack the expertise to review every claim, but the system allows other experts to check it. And in principle, we can gain the relevant expertise ourselves. For example, I have a master's degree in social science, so I can read social science journal articles and evaluate their methodology. In one of my classes, the professor gave us published papers and asked us to find flaws in them. I was surprised that I could identify some basic methodological problems even in peer-reviewed papers. That experience gave me more confidence in my ability to evaluate research, but it also made me more cautious. Peer review does not magically make a claim true. Documentation does not magically remove all uncertainty, but it gives us something to examine. That is why testimony alone does not carry the same evidential weight here. My point is that modern research papers are very different from ancient resurrection testimonies. With a research paper, there is at least something for a third party to examine. With ancient resurrection testimony, we do not have that kind of access. We either trust the reports or we don't. That is a major difference. We should not collapse both cases into testimony as if they are evidentially equivalent. There is another difference that apologists often minimize. When scientists tell us they found a link between smoking and cancer, most people do not raise their eyebrows because the claim fits with what we already know about the world. Tumors exist. Cigarettes exist. Chemical exposure can damage cells. The proposed mechanisms are naturalistic and testable. Nothing about that kind of claim requires a miracle. But with Jesus' resurrection, we are talking about a kind of event that has never been independently established as something that happens. Our ordinary experience tells us that dead bodies do not naturally return to immortal life that can pass through solid objects. So the question is, can testimony alone establish the historicity of an event like that? For me, I am not sure it can. This is where the phrase extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence makes sense. Or in Bayesian terms, a claim with a very low prior probability requires stronger evidence than a claim with a higher prior probability. That is not close-mindedness, it is common sense. We all reason that way. So the implication should not be, since we trust expert testimony today, even though experts can be wrong, we should also trust ancient testimony about miracles, even though the witnesses could be wrong. I don't think that follows. If you think it does, leave a comment under the video and explain why. I would be very interested to hear your reasoning. I think the implication goes in the opposite direction. If even modern peer-reviewed scientific research can be wrong, even with documentation, data, expert review, and possible replication, then we should be even more cautious with ancient miracle reports. Here we are dealing with ancient manuscripts written by people whose exact identities we cannot always establish, drawing on sources we usually cannot identify, reporting events that violate what we normally observe about how nature works. In that situation, skeptics are completely justified in saying, I am not sure that happened. I don't think we even need to bite a bullet to say that. We can say it with a straight face and mean it 100%. Even if 2 or 3 people told me directly that they experienced a miracle, I would not simply believe it on testimony alone. I would want additional evidence. If it were a healing miracle, I would at least want before and after medical documentation. And even then, if the documentation were weak or incomplete, I might still think something else was going on. So why should I lower my standard for the resurrection of Jesus? If anything, the standard should be higher, not lower. I think Mike Jones would agree with the general principle. He openly admitted that if he discovered an empty grave, his first thought would not be, a miracle happened. His first thought would be that someone moved the body. And even if someone he trusted told him the dead person had risen, he still would not immediately believe it. He says the evidence would become sufficient when the deceased person appeared to him.
If my father died and then I went to the grave and it was empty, my first thought would be grave robbers. And then my mom said, no, he came back to life. I'd be like, Mom, I know you're grieving, but it's okay. And then my brother said it. And they were in their right mind. They weren't like being frantic. I would probably start to go, okay, maybe something did happen here. And then if my dad appeared to me, okay, he came back from the dead. So obviously, I can't just be like, no, you were faking laying in the grave. I think I could pretty much from that testimony, I think we have sufficient evidence here.
That is exactly the point. Mike would not believe based on personally verifying an empty grave. He would not even immediately believe testimony from living people he personally knows and trusts speaking to him face to face. He would need the dead person to appear to him. And keep in mind, this is Mike's standard as a Christian. He already believes resurrection is possible. He already believes God has raised someone from the dead before. He is not starting from a naturalistic worldview where resurrection is ruled out in advance. Even with that background belief, he still would not jump from an empty grave and trusted testimony to "my father rose from the dead." And doesn't that sound like the disciples themselves? When the woman told the disciples that Jesus had risen, Luke says their words seemed like nonsense, and the disciples did not believe them. If the story stopped there, I don't think any of us, including Christians, would fault the disciples for disbelief. Resurrection is not an ordinary event after all. Now, I'm not saying Mike would refuse to believe in Jesus' resurrection unless Jesus appeared to him personally. Obviously, he thinks belief in Jesus' resurrection is intellectually defensible without that personal experience. He would say the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is stronger than directly observing an empty grave plus 2 sincere witnesses telling him what they saw. That is his standard, and I respect that. But that is where I think skeptics are justified. Mike's own hypothetical gives him much better evidence than what I think we have today for Jesus' resurrection. He gets to personally inspect the empty grave. He gets direct testimony from people he knows and trusts, and even then, he says he would not be convinced until the dead person appeared to him. From the skeptic's perspective, we do not have anything close to that for Jesus' resurrection. We do not personally inspect the empty tomb. We do not hear testimony directly from people we know and trust. We cannot interview the witnesses, test their memory, examine their mental state, or ask whether they influenced each other. What we have are ancient texts, written decades later by authors whose sources we usually cannot verify. So if Mike, as a Christian who already believes resurrection is possible, is allowed to say, an empty grave plus trusted face-to-face testimony is not enough for me, then skeptics are surely allowed to say ancient resurrection reports are not enough for us, and Christians should not accuse us of presupposing philosophical naturalism for saying that. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I try to live by that rule because I do not want to be gullible. Not anymore. And this brings me to a deeper problem. If God exists, and if this God really wants each of us to believe in him, it is strange that he would choose such an ambiguous method of revelation. The evidence is unclear enough that many sincere people can reasonably reject it. We are not talking about people who hate God or refuse to follow the evidence. We are talking about people who look at the same evidence and honestly conclude that it is not enough. What makes this even stranger is that this same God supposedly condemns people for believing in pagan miracles and following pagan deities, often on the basis of similar kinds of evidence, testimony, tradition, religious experience, and miracle stories passed down within a community. Okay, I have many more arguments I could make against HRN and Bayesian apologetics for the resurrection, but this video has to stop somewhere. So my final remark is this. I think it is unrealistic for Christians to argue that Jesus' resurrection is more probable than all naturalistic alternatives. That is a very difficult case to make. The evidence we actually have is too indirect, too dependent on uncertain sources, and too vulnerable to embellishment, theological shaping, and oral transmission. At some point, I think Christians should just be honest about what they are doing. They trust the gospel authors. They trust the traditions behind the gospels. They trust that the resurrection testimonies were preserved accurately. They trust that those testimonies point to historical facts as they actually happened. That is faith. I know faith in the Christian context means more than that. It can include loyalty, trust, hope, and commitment, but it cannot mean less than that. It still involves trusting that the resurrection happened, even though the publicly available evidence leaves room for serious doubt. Now I want to hear from you. What issues do you think I should have raised but did not include here? Which arguments were new to you, or which ones did you find the most convincing? Let me know in the comments section. I have talked long enough, and now it's your turn. And if you don't mind, consider signing up as a free member on my Patreon. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.